Okay, that's what I thought I'd do. Look at the camera.
You want me to pull back so you want to lose the mask while you do the
Oh,
introduction?
geez, I forgot all about it.
That's good. That's a good sign, but years from now, they will wonder why you had a mask.
No, I'm going to say that too. Are you good? All right, so here we go. Thank you, Greg. Hello, from the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown. I'm Dennis Webster from radio station WJTN. This extraordinary center, dedicated to the life and work of Robert H. Jackson, recently celebrated its 20th anniversary. If you were to ask anyone who has been close to the development of the Jackson Center how it came to be, who was responsible for making it happen, I suspect the first person they would mention is Greg Peterson. Greg is an attorney at the Phillips Lytle Law Office in Jamestown, and he joins me here now. Greg, thank you for making it possible for me to conduct this interview.
Well, thank you for my opportunity to be with you. You're the consummate interviewer, and I couldn't think of nothing better than to have Dennis Webster here.
Well, yeah, you're very kind. We come together today to talk about your work in helping to found this institution. And I guess I would like to begin by asking you this question. Do you recall in your life, Greg Peterson, when you first became aware of the life and work of Robert H. Jackson?
As an attorney in town and attending bar association meetings and seeing the composites of the various members of the bars, past and current, you can't help but notice only one United States Supreme Court justice on that composite, and that's Robert H. Jackson. So there was a sense of pride, and I think every bar member had, in knowing they were part of the bar association of which he was a part. And then you started asking a little bit about him since he died in 1954. And there weren't that many current bar members who knew about him. And that seemed sort of sad because they would generally know he was a member of the Supreme Court because he was Justice Robert Jackson. They would know that he was buried in Frewsburg, New York. They would tell you that he practiced law in Jamestown. I'm not sure how long or what he really did. And they would tell you that he was involved in the Nuremberg trial, but as time lapsed, they might not remember whether he was a judge of the Nuremberg trial or a prosecutor of the Nuremberg trial. So there was a gap of time and of interest. So that probably was the seed that was planted just to kind of know a little bit more about him. I perhaps going to add more. What sort of solidified an interest that I had in history generally, certainly Jamestown history specifically, was when the statue that was located on 8th and North Main was dedicated by Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. I went there. My wife actually drove her down from Chautauqua. And I noticed that the family members were here, both Justice Jackson's son and daughter, as well as other dignitaries. And that was a gala event. And when you listen to the words of Justice O'Connor talking about, in a short form biographical piece, what he did, what he accomplished, and how proud Jamestown could be to have had him as a native son. Having been educated here and grown here, we should be justly proud. So that was perhaps an inspiration. I'm a video guy. I was taking videos of Justice O'Connor and actually had a chance to meet the family members at a luncheon at Moonbrook thereafter. So that probably was the beginning in 1996 of an inspiration which found form later.
So I'm glad you put the year on there because I wanted to sort of target a very pivotal time period, essential time period for the formation of the Robert H. Jackson Center that began around that time. Now, from what I understand, you were not the only person in Jamestown who was inspired by that event at Love School. And I remember being there myself with our 2 young children and my mother at the time. But there were others there at that moment or in the community at that time who had some sense of, we as a community ought to do something more to make sure that Robert H. Jackson's life and work were properly remembered in what was, in many ways, his hometown. Who were those other people?
Well, I think some of the folks were John Hamilton, who was really the inspiration for the statue, and John Hamilton was the executive director of the Gebbe Foundation. Phil Morris, who was the head of the Arts Council. I'm not sure that was the exact term at the time, but he was very much involved in creating the event itself in 1996. There were folks who attended, such as Betty LeNay, and it was well covered by C-SPAN and well covered by others, and the community itself, the Chautauqua Region Community Foundation. So they were all part of that particular event, all of which walked away with a glow and probably an afterglow, which found form a few years later. And that was really the beginning. I should probably just add a postscript. During that 1996-97 time period, one of my partners in the law firm, Philip Slidell, was a guy named Jim Summer. And Jim handed me a book shortly after the O'Connor event, authored by Eugene Gerhardt. And it's called Robert H. Jackson, America's Advocate. And it was at the time, and still is, one of the major biographies of Jackson, so I read it. Well, now it gave form to what I had heard in this book, and then I learned that he was, the author was, of this 1958 book, was still alive, and in Binghamton, New York. And so in 1999, on a whim and a camera and a tripod, drove out to his law office and interviewed him. And that really now, if there was embers that were perhaps smoldering, that lit the flame even more so. But Eugene Gerhardt's book was very pivotal in my thinking.
So what were your thoughts or your feelings at that moment, if you can recall them, Greg? Did you see all of this unfolding as it has now over 20 plus years, if you're talking about 1997 and we speak here in 2021, or was it just an emotion, an impetus to go forward in some way?
No, nothing. We're sitting here in the Kappa Theater in a 19,000 square foot building here in 2021. No way I had this in mind. Putting things into context, at that time in the late 1990s, Phil Morris and the Arts Council created a Lucille Ball Center. I'm going to draw the name, but basically designated. And on Pine Street, there was a building that they purchased contiguous to the Reg LeNay Civic Center. And it was a long, narrow building, and they received a grant to put up a touch screen activity and posters, et cetera. And the idea was to come and honor Lucille Ball.
The first Lucy Desi Museum.
Yeah, and at the time, Desi was not part of it, but yeah, it was the first Lucille Ball Museum right there on Pine Street. And there was a building next to it, similar, narrow, long. So if there was a thought, is that there ought to maybe have a similar thing honoring a similar notable from Jamestown being in the form of Justice Jackson. And that was kind of the percolating concept in my head, but it hadn't really found form other than that.
I think the viewers of this video, if they don't know your story already, will sense over the time that we talk a certain theme about those years and maybe all of the 20 years so far of the Jackson Center itself in terms of serendipitous events and gatherings and meetings that you were in an ideal position to take advantage of, or have some sense of the potential when certain people came together to talk about Jackson or anything, and you found those opportunities and used them to help really over a short period of time take what you have described as some loosely gathered ideas and thoughts and a little center. And from that time of 1996 to 1997 to 2000 and 2001, so we're really talking about a 4-year period, an awful lot happened. What were some of those serendipitous events, as you remember them now, Greg, that really pushed forward and expanded this concept?
Really, two of them, if there are two themes, and they were totally serendipitous. One, I do love oral history. I think it's great to preserve that which has occurred here in Jamestown, and have been blessed to have many organizations, including WJTN and your background, to help us find some information. But prior to really the Jackson Center taking form, there was a historical event where Justice Jackson's funeral occurred in Jamestown in 1954, October of 1954, I believe October 8th of 1954. And all of the surviving 8 justices of the United States Supreme Court by train came here. That, to me, is an unbelievable day that most everybody either didn't talk about or had forgotten. It just, time had lapsed. So I, with camera in hand, interviewed several septuagenarian and octogenarian lawyers who were involved in the funeral of Justice Robert Jackson at St. Luke's. The Charlie Price, who was the president of the Bar Association, Sam Price, his brother, Bill Wright, Bob Booty, Wayne Herrick, it goes on. And they were all willing to talk about that moment in time, that one day in Jamestown, New York, where 8 justices showed up. The Earl Warrens, the William O. Douglases, the Felix Frankfurters. And if you were a young lawyer having lunch with them, because they did have lunch, you remembered everything. It was emblazoned as you can remember. So I captured those stories and put together a little amateur documentary. This was in 2000. And serendipitously and simultaneously, Carl Kappa was being awarded the John D. Hamilton Award. And I was curious about Carl. Here was an Italian, an American who did very well, owner of Crawford Furniture, very philanthropic, owner of really the beginnings of the Chautauqua Region Community Foundation. But I really knew him, but I didn't know him. So through several attempts, principally through his sister, he permitted me to interview him about his life story, just to capture it. I just thought this is a rags to riches story. And it was during that June of 2000 interview at Crawford where I asked Carl the question, which I thought was just a throwaway. As an Italian-American boy in Jamestown, New York, in the South Side, who was your hero? Who was your role model in the 30s? Now, the giveaway answer has to be Joe DiMaggio.
Baseball player.
Baseball, Italian. You got to be kidding me. This is a no-brainer. No. The answer was Robert Jackson. Now, Carl had no clue that I was tinkering with the interviews on these, the funeral or reading the book or anything like that. Came out of nowhere. That he was a hero, and here's a guy who pulled himself up, Carl saying this, and he pulled himself up by the bootstraps and led the largest criminal case in the 20th century from Jamestown, New York. That's amazing.
That then lit the fire for you?
Oh, you can't, it was such a, nothing I could finesse or anticipate or hope to get when you have meetings. Sometimes you think maybe here's an agenda, I hope to get there. This was out of nowhere. Out of nowhere. So now, later on, again, without mentioning anything, I said, Carl, what do you want to do? He goes, I think I'd like to do one more project. He was diagnosed with cancer at the time. I'd like to do one more project, and hopefully downtown Jamestown, it would be important. So I walked away from the interview saying, whoa, let's keep thinking here. Which then led to a July meeting at Sportsman's Club with Betty Linnae. Now, Blackstone physically is located contiguous to Crawford.
Right.
Yet they really didn't know, Carl didn't know Betty that well, and Betty didn't know Carl that well. But I talked to Betty about, hey, I talked to your neighbor, and he mentioned Robert Jackson, and she sort of politely listened to me and said, well, at some point, if you want to talk about it, I'd be glad to. Thirdly, serendipitously, I was having lunch with Tom Cardman. Tom Cardman was the executive director of the Gebbe Foundation at the time, having succeeded John Hamilton. And we were at Ironstone having lunch. And there was Carl. And I was walking by, I said, Tom, who had never met Carl, Tom, this is Carl Kappa, Crawford extraordinaire, and oh, by the way, a big fan of Robert Jackson, and Tom, I'll talk to you about that at lunch. That was not on the agenda. But since Carl was there, why not? I'm just that kind of guy, I guess. So the next thing you know, Tom, tell me more, what do you think, And so, well, now I have the Gebbe Foundation at least listening. And so with those three disparate meetings, one Carl's, which was a bolt out of the blue, Betty subsequently, because of a contiguous neighborhood relationship, and Tom Cardman with an unrelated luncheon at the Ironstone and a serendipitous meeting with Carl, who happened to be there with his friends. It then led to I'm just continuing to have conversation.
I want to do a couple of things here for the benefit of the viewers who may not be familiar with Jamestown if they are seeing this at some point. The Linnaeus, Reg and Betty Linnae, were responsible for Blackstone Corporation on Allen Street, and it was located right next to Carl Kappa's business of Crawford Furniture. It's interesting for me to hear you say that they were neighbors but didn't really know each other or had that much in common with each other, because between Carl and Reg, they were major employers, major industries in Jamestown in the time period leading up to the 1950s and 60s, and maybe a little beyond that. I'm going to say more than I know here, perhaps, in terms of the timeline, but they were very important people in the community and had run very successful businesses. Now, we should say something about the Gebbe Foundation, too, and that they were the major foundation in the community at that time in terms of the resources that they would be able to bring to a project.
Gebbe Foundation, created by the Gebbe family through Carnation Stock, was at the time and continues to be probably the foremost foundation here, led 25 years worth by John Hamilton, and it continues to be a major focus. And I think it's also kind of interesting, and just you wonder why Carl Kappa and Betty Linnae may not have met much from two different sectors within Jamestown. Carl was very much a blue-collar, rose up from literally on the line at Crawford to get to here, so he was sort of the south side of town. And Reg and Betty, having come from and Reg certainly from the north side of town, which was more of the longer-standing traditional manufacturers, just segments in the society. Not one to the exclusion of the other, but their social paths would not have necessarily crossed. So really, through the Jackson Center, it was sort of an amalgamation of a lot of interests and diversity within the city itself. I never really thought about it till right now, but that this happens to be.
Something is about to happen, and viewers, I'm going to hold you in suspense for a moment because there's another meeting, at least one, maybe several others, that led to the founding of this institution. But I want to stop you, Greg Peterson, for a moment and just have you look back, and your perceptions of this I think would be important to me and to people who are watching this. Who was Robert H. Jackson at the time that he died unexpectedly in 1954? What did the world see in him? Why was it such a momentous event that all of these Supreme Court justices would come here to Jamestown for that funeral?
One, Justice Jackson was extremely well known in his time as a writer of great understanding in the Supreme Court. He'd also had 10 years prior, was the chief American prosecutor at the Nuremberg trial, which gave him a great deal of uniqueness. And the trial, though it had not found complete form as to its legacy, which is sort of being celebrated now, nevertheless, he was well respected for having been creating out of whole cloth something that had never happened ever. And he died at age 62, so it was sort of very untimely. And so there was a sort of shock value, and the fact he died while in as a member of the Supreme Court led to the 8 justices doing something really unprecedented coming here. He, of course, as a background, as the brief Reader's Digest, he was born in 1892 in Spring Creek Township, Pennsylvania, Warren County. Age 5 comes to Chautauqua County, Frewsburg, New York. He graduates from Frewsburg High School, does a 13th year in Jamestown High School, 1909-1910. Never goes to college. Goes to law school for 1 year, reads for the law here, passes the bar at his earliest age possible, age 21. Practices law here for 20 years, very successfully, representing everything from unions to individuals to corporations. Very successful practice. And through his own initiative, perhaps, but he became, had a relationship with State Senator Roosevelt, Frank Roosevelt, which subsequently became Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt, and then President Franklin D. Roosevelt. And through his party affiliation and friendship, he was one of the few Democrats in Chautauqua County, by the way, he became part of the kitchen cabinet, if you will, in New York, and then subsequently was asked to go to Washington in 1934 to be part of the Department of Justice, Assistant Attorney General on antitrust. He prosecuted Andrew Mellon. He then became in various other positions, and then subsequently became Solicitor General, Attorney General, Justice of the Supreme Court, in answer to a Jeopardy question, named the only person who's held all 3 of those positions. And then, of course, the Nuremberg trial, and dies in 1954. So that, for the listener, is a brief bio of which we paused to celebrate here.
And it seems to me, as I hear you speak, that you were, as these ideas were coming together for the Robert H. Jackson Center, interested, maybe a little mystified as to how someone with this extraordinary biography, all of these achievements, had sort of been set aside a little bit or had been sidelined by the time we get to this time period now leading up to the year 2000. A lot of it had, if not been forgotten, at least not thought of a lot in the mainstream, even here in Jamestown.
And I think from even the scholarship viewpoint, Dennis, I've learned this only after the fact, very little was written about Jackson's because of his jurisprudence. He wasn't liberal, he wasn't conservative, now known as sort of a practical jurisprudence, pragmatic jurisprudence, and therefore not easy to typecast or put into a biographical format. So really, Eugene Gerhardt was the first to take a shot at it posthumously. Really since then, very little actual big-time scholarship has occurred, though much has been written. So I think part of that is during that time period, the scholars didn't know quite how to put them, so therefore it was easier to grab a Black, a Douglas, Frankfurter, and write about them.
I would be interested in your thoughts more about Jackson and his jurisprudence and more on that subject, but we need to get back to 2000 here for a moment, because as events accelerated from the time period of the dedication of the statue near Love School in 1996, through the events that you've talked about, we're now in the year 2000, and there was this most fortuitous gathering that you called, I think, at your office?
Right, on December 14th, the kind of everybody, I'm seeing these people separately, socially, and I said, we got to get together, we got to get together. Not quite sure what that meant. So I said, all right, we got to do it. We picked a December date, December 14th. And at my office, we had Carl Kappa, Betty Lene, Tom Cardman, and Phil Morris. And I said, here's where we are. I've talked to all of you separately, and I thought I'd just try to talk to you collectively, which we did. And essentially, they were very encouraging. The only concept at that time on December 14th was that building that was contiguous to the Lucy building. I said, if we raise money, maybe we can get enough to fill a building with pictures and people can walk through and touch a screen or two and hear his voice at Nuremberg, et cetera. So it was sort of a pat on the head. The next piece of serendipity is a lawyer in town named Stan Weeks. He was a Mason. Jackson was a 33rd degree Mason, as was Stan. And Stan was on his way leaving to go for his summer vacations, I think in the islands someplace. He called me. He says, Greg, if you're ever interested in doing something about Jackson, I should point out that Stan was the first guy I talked about as far as attending the funeral back in like January of 2000. So this is like a year lapse. He just called. Serendipitous. So if you're interested, the building, the Scottish Rite Consistory building, has a contract on it. And since Jackson was a Mason, and you're considering doing something for him, it might be good to contemplate the Masonic building.
This place where we are now?
Right where we are now. First time I'd ever even thought about this. This is a 19,000 square foot building, and I'm thinking about something that's a postage stamp. So I came up and talked to Carlton Winchester, who had an office in the second floor, and that's where he had. And I sat down, and I knew him, but didn't know him. Said, here's the thought. He goes, well, we do have an offer, and we're going to react to it fairly soon. And he didn't tell me what the terms were or the person. He just kept it very close to his vest. So I went back and I called Betty. I said, what do you think? She goes, well, it's your call, Greg. You're going to lead the ship, so go ahead. Think about it. So I did think about it, and I came over with a blank contract with my name. Gregory Peterson, or an entity to be formed, a contract, and I left the purchase price blank with a cover letter saying, I will match, not knowing. I will match the price of the other person.
Now, is this prior to that December meeting?
No, after.
Okay.
Again, at the December meeting, I was just thinking of the postage stamp building. Thereafter, Stan Weeks calls me, this out of the blue, and drops another bombshell for me. So I come over and I talk here to Carl Winchester, and he says, all right, but we're going to probably act on the other one in a week. So I said, oh my gosh. So I called Betty again. I said, I've dropped off in my name a blank contract, and I don't know what to do. So she called Judge Willard Cass. Judge Cass another 33rd degree Mason, very close friend with Betty. And I'm not sure to this day what happened, but somehow there was a Masonic injunction. I only surmise that Judge Cass called, because he could, and said, time out. So that put the game in play. So now there's 2 contracts. And not to prolong the story, but they then offered a chance for both of us to meet before the membership to present our cases.
Mm.
And as would have it, I let the other person go first because I was being so nice, knowing full well that in his contract, he wanted the Masons out.
Mm.
In other words, he wanted this building empty. He was going to turn it into a call center. So I said, of course I went second, I said, I'm going to pay the same price. I'll let you stay, because Jackson would want his body to stay here. And we're going to honor a 33rd degree Mason, of which you're all Masons. So we won the day. Now, here's where it gets a little nervous for me.
Because you put your name on this contract
Yeah,
with no money behind you.
no money. Just a lot of patting on the head.
And when they finally filled in the price, what was it?
$120,000 was the price for this whole building. Now, I must tell you, you're in it today, and you'd say, what a deal.
Yeah, it was.
But it was in terrible, terrible condition. But what was compelling is we're in a theater right now at the Capitol Theater. And it's that, here we are in downtown Jamestown, and we have a theater that's 180 seats, which is very comfortable for events. Wow, this is amazing. But it's still, there was a number, they filled it in, now I'm on the hook. And I thought, well, I better gather the troops again. So this is the magic, real day. Right here, this theater. Right behind you is a chair we had set up for Carl to sit. Carl came. Betty sat right next to him. And I'd had lunch, more serendipity. Okay, more serendipity. This was an afternoon meeting. I had lunch with Dan Bratton. Recently retired at the end of 2000, January 1st, or December 31st, 2000 was his last day. So we were having lunch.
Chautauqua Institution
Chautauqua
president.
Institution, yes. He was president of Chautauqua Institution. So he retired and he was going to Arizona. So we had lunch, we were talking baseball because he's a New York Mets fan, as am I. So I said, Dan, you might as well go from lunch, sit in there, and I'm going to make a pitch. You'll know Betty, you'll know some of the people. And I invited Carl, Phil Morris, Betty Linnae, Tom Cardman, and Harold Adams. Harold Adams, a name I need to bring up. Harold Adams was the nephew of Robert H. Jackson, and a person who I'd gone to just to get advice about Jackson, and who's the family members, et cetera. Because one of the things I needed to be sure of, that I didn't get ahead of myself, because if we had a Jackson Center, and, excuse me, and the family didn't want it, it wouldn't get very far. I needed some family connect, and Harold was the only nephew and was in town. And I knew him, so he came. They said they might as well all hear this at one time. So I literally sat in a chair right here. They sat there, and I explained what had happened. Remember how we guys were talking about a little storefront? And within a month, here we are talking about this huge building that looks like it's falling down. And Carl, I didn't even get halfway through my speech. By the way, there was nothing, maybe one page that I had like this. There's no write-up of a grand plan. I think that's critical. This was just guts, all guts. And Carl said, I said I'd be interested in something. I'm interested. I'm in for $500,000. And I had never asked how much. And then Betty, I may be making a little bit of this up, but a little tear in her eye, puts her arm around because we sat next to her and says, Carl, if it's important to you, it's important for me, and I'm in for $500,000. So I'm like stunned. And so then sitting over there was Tom Cardman. I go, tongue in cheek, they go, Tom, you know. And of course, he's the executive director, and he could say nothing more than, I'm amazed with everything going on, and we'll certainly work on it. So not knowing any of this was going to happen, it happened very electrically. So I now knew that my nut was covered to buy the building.
Well, yeah, $120,000, and suddenly you've got $1 million committed.
Yeah, and with more potential. So it was like a half-hour meeting, and I said, let's take a quick tour. And so we went downstairs, and for those who ever may take a tour downstairs, there's a sink in the basement as you go down there, and on the disposal, it says the manufacturer is Jackson. So Carl pointed that out immediately. Look, this is meant to be
Huh.
Jackson. So we continued our tour, and while continuing the tour, Dan Bratton, who again was sitting in the peanut gallery, came up and grabbed me and goes, I'm your executive director.
He just said that to you.
Just said it, out of the blue. I go, Dan, aren't you retiring, going to Arizona? I'll postpone that, but I'll be your executive director. I'll give you, he started rattling off terms. I go, sure. I mean, Dan Bratton, this is the Dan Bratton. So within roughly an hour, in a January 2001 meeting here, commitments from Carl, Betty, a promise to advance from the Gebby, an idea, which subsequently they matched everybody. And then to have Dan Bratton grab my arm and say, I'm your executive director, was incredible. You can't make this story up.
This was, it seems so predictable, looking back at it now in terms of how the dominoes began to fall, and yet so special in terms of how it all came together. Do you ever look at yourself and see how instrumental you were in connecting these people and finessing them and getting them interested in what was still an idea under formulation in your own mind, Greg?
You know, I'm not unmindful of the fact that somebody had to connect the dots, and not unmindful that there's a sort of, I hate to use the term salesmanship because that sometimes has not always a negative, it has a negative determination, but you got to sell a project and a dream. And they also knew by doing so they had me too. I mean, part of this is you're presenting an idea, but if they accept it, I bought in too. And so yeah, it was a team effort. It all of a sudden congealed very quickly. A point I must make is at the end of our discussion before we took the tour, Harold Adams was here and just stood up, and he was in a suit, beautiful. And he said, on behalf of the family of Robert Jackson, I tell you that Justice Jackson would be pleased. That's all he said. All he said. And like, wow, what an ending. It's like you could not have drum rolled the day any better.
You said a little earlier when you first went to interview Jackson's biographer, Eugene Gerhard, that all of this was the last thing you were thinking of. What about that moment, Greg, in early 2001, when all of this came together right around where we sit here and talk today? Did you have some idea at that point what could happen for the center at this place?
Yeah, a couple things. No. Yes and no. In one sense, you got a huge building, and we had no artifacts. We had no memorabilia. We just knew there was a book that was written in 1958 about it. You know, how do we get the word out about Jackson? That's part of the grand scheme, if you will, and hoping that this center building here would be become a jewel of the community. Now, that's probably pretty bold thinking. Things happen very quickly thereafter to make that a reality. But if you're trying to crawl into your head, there's a degree of excitement, but also nervousness. Because this building was in really tough shape. So you had to come through and look and say, how are we going to save this roof structure here in the theater? Who's going to do that? Nobody of the investors, including me, I'm just a lawyer, to know how to do that. And enter a guy named Don Blomquist, who was very instrumental and had history of the building itself, kind of came in and said, here's the big picture, here's what we need to do, and sort of seriatim decided the steps to save the building. But no, at the time...
Define Don a little bit, his work, his life. He's a contractor?
Yeah, Don is a contractor, long-standing contractor, and then he became executive director of code for many, many years, really built that up to really kind of what it is today. But Don was a Mason, and Don had done work in the building, and so he had some history. And so Don was he's still alive, a doer. I mean, he just makes things happen. He knows everybody in the contracting business. So if we needed a roof to be fixed, if we needed sconces to be put in, electrical work, he magically made it happen.
So you have the genesis of an idea here that you're going to build a center, create something in this place that honors the life and the work and the contribution of Robert H. Jackson. It's still no more defined than that at that moment?
No. I knew we had to do something immediately, because now the word's going to get out that this group bought the Jackson Center. What's the mission? What's this? So we immediately created a board, and we met at the Chautauqua Region Community Foundation, enter Randy Sweeney, and their continued ongoing involvement for the last 20 years, because he hosted us. So
Randy was the executive director of the foundation at that time.
I'm sorry, yes, the executive director of the Chautauqua Region Community Foundation. So we would meet there, Carl, Betty, myself, somebody from Gebby was there, excuse me, and myself, just to kind of start brainstorming. And that we also added soon thereafter, and Bill Cass. So that was really the original board. And we added shortly thereafter Raleigh Kidder and Bruce Janowski, and Randy Sweeney was our board member. So that we just kept meeting and meeting. We met weekly. I mean, this was not a once a month, this was weekly, because things were happening rapidly. And we knew we had to have an event to bring it all together. We closed April 1st of 2001. Closed, we own the building. Great, now we own a building. Got the corporate name, structure, governance. Then Law Day is May 1st. So I reached out to Eugene Gerhardt, our attorney friend in Binghamton.
The Jackson biographer.
Jackson biographer. He's 82, 3. And I asked him, would you like to come and open it? And he came. And so we literally took the basement, which was in shambles, and this place. So we just kind of focused in on theater, clean it up. And Don Blomquist brought in a scat of people, just clean, plaster, everything, because we had 1 month. And down in the basement, through a relationship, my wife, very supportive, but she was general counsel at Bush Industries, and through her connections, we had people from Bush Industries, Lorraine Melise specifically, to come and plan a huge event downstairs. And so they came and converted a mess, ice sculptures and all this stuff within a month. Huge event. Gerhardt comes, we film it. One of the early decisions we made, we'd film everything. And we did. So here we have the biographer, Eugene Gerhardt, We have the grand gala. We had only had it for 1 month. Every bar member, everybody showed up, all dressed to the nines. Bar association got engaged. Community members got engaged. So we launched, because I knew you had to have something quickly. And we did. So we were thrilled. It worked out incredibly well. Eugene Gerhardt went to the cemetery where Jackson was. So we gave him a tour. He was covered by all the media. And yeah, that was the launch, if you will, programmatically, May 1st, 2001.
Two things come to mind that I think the viewers and those who are curious about the development of the center might want to know at this point, Greg. And one of them is, how did you talk to the community about this, beyond the intimate group that you had brought together to support this enthusiastically and to really get it going? And did you encounter resistance when you brought it out further?
I did a lot of dog and pony shows. The Rotary clubs, the Kiwanis, all that stuff, just to get the word out. And so, and all the media, and certainly Jim Roselli, your predecessor, adapted it very early on, and wonderfully so. Post Journal, especially, Christy Herbst. In fact, they covered, they actually printed some stuff that they did, finding quotes, and created something for us so we could hand out. She did it on her own, Christy did. So, and as far as resistance, I think it was more the community, never a resistance to the idea. In fact, I've yet to have anything like that. But there's a factor of how many operations and ideas start. There's a great deal of enthusiasm that levels off and dies. And is this another one of those? And so I think that I was asked about that, who's behind it? Well, when they heard it was Betty and Carl and Gabby and Dan Braden and bar associations, we got a lot of stakeholders. And I think that's the critical moment is we had a lot of people we got engaged, and they all then had a stake in it, including the Masons themselves. So it's sort of a village. We created a village, and they were supporting it.
And you have talked often about the really bad condition that this facility was in. Did you have to find additional funds then in order to rehabilitate this place so that it could be even operational beyond that first event that you had?
Yes. Timeline-wise, Dan Bratton, who joined us and had actually provided us much early leadership, died in, I think, of May of 2001, June, of pancreatic cancer. It was really unfortunate.
Tragic loss.
A tragic loss. But he had written quite a bit while he was going through his malady about his vision of the center. Terrific. Just terrific. And shortly after he passed away, I reached out to Raleigh Kidder, who was retiring as an investment manager, to see if he might be interested.
Former Assemblyman, Jamestown area.
Yes, thank you. Former Assemblyman, Jamestown, lawyer, businessman, just a World War, or a war veteran of the Vietnam War.
And passionate about history in a way that you are also.
Perfect. And so he decided he would become our executive director, and he had relations, especially with the Assembly and the New York State Senate, and between, frankly, Pat McGee,
State Senator at that time.
State Senator, Bill Parmet, our State Assemblyman. They came, saw the vision at the time, and made New York State funds available to us. Quite a bit, in fact. And that wouldn't happen today, but timing was everything. And so we were able to find additional funding and additional foundation support from just about every foundation in Jamestown supported us capital-wise. So the sum total, as we're sitting here today, we don't have any debt, which is exciting for me to say, but we really did not want to borrow money on the if come. So we didn't. That was a philosophical decision, having seen a few not-for-profits who did, and it caused subsequent angst. So that's where we got the extra funding for, literally walking our way through this building to where we are today.
How was it for you at that point, realizing that, if I may use the phrase, an inkling had expanded into an idea that had exploded into a center over a very short period of time, and you're not under the employment of the Robert H. Jackson Center. You are continuing to be a practicing attorney at Phillips Lytle in Jamestown. Was that hard for you, Greg?
Well, that's a very good point. I'm delighted you brought that up, Dennis. This would not have happened but for my firm. I'm a partner in Phillips Lytle, which is a Buffalo-based law firm with offices throughout New York State. They believe in community participation. They believe as a philosophy of philanthropy. And I had to get their blessings, no question, because I was dedicated to put in some time. But with their blessings, encouragement, and they see the value. I saw it, of course, but there are 100 lawyers plus, and they had to see it, and they did. So early on, they gave, have at it, Greg, and we'll encourage you to do that, and they did.
So you were allowed to use some of your professional time to dedicate to the development of this center.
Correct, and I can't, if you're seeing it, guys, I can't thank you enough. But yeah, that is a critical component to the advancement of the center, is the permission of the time necessary for whatever leadership and or programming that had happened.
You know, it occurs to me to say this too, at this juncture, considering all that you have said so far about the earliest years and the development of this center, a lot of us go through life wishing if we just had a little bit more of this, or a little bit more of the cooperation from a certain person, that things would be better for us. Whether it's our personal lives, our professional lives, or concepts such as you had, suddenly you had it all. Suddenly it all came together. How did you move on from there, knowing that a lot of what you reached for, you automatically, immediately got?
Well, I think success breeds success. And in the community itself, we made sure that we created a buzz. There was usually something every month here, and usually live. Mm-hmm. We're in a pandemic right now, and so it's a different world. But at the time, having somebody here who knew Jackson, who was part of his world, Nuremberg, the courts, and so the crowd could see it, touch it. One buzz led to another buzz, and the media was all over it. And so again, success breeds success. And I knew that. You had to have, like the Gerhard, that we had to nail it right away. And we did. And that led to other events even during that first year, which were kind of blockbusters, which led to C-SPAN coming, which led to a whole lot of things happening.
Your sense of needing to keep some space on the marquee, if you'll allow me to say it that way, for the Robert H. Jackson Center, drove you to do something else, which you and I have talked about privately in the past, which was really a gift to this place and to the memory of Robert H. Jackson, in that in order to fulfill that need to keep the Jackson Center on the marquee, you reached as far and as deeply as you could to find those people who, again, this story had been sort of set aside, or if not forgotten, at least not remembered often in the time period from his death in the early 1950s to the year 2000. And you suddenly were motivated to reach and find anybody who had direct connection with him at any point in his ascendancy as a professional.
Yeah. I think when we started this in 2001, we didn't know whether there was anybody alive who actually paths had crossed with Jackson. Turned out through a variety of sources, one of them being a book authored by Joe Persico on Nuremberg in 1996, which I read at Chautauqua. It was a paperback book, and that was really another one of those Gerhard moments when you're leafing through it, easy read. And he kept talking about Jackson and the whole story, but he mentioned a lot of people. So when we got started, still have the book, is the Joe Persico book marked like you can't believe with those people he had talked to or had interviewed. And so to me in 1996 or 95 when he put out the book, they were probably still alive. Enter white pages, books, phone calls.
There was you didn't Google it at that
no
time.
Googling then. And you just kept finding people and saying, would you be willing to come here? And there was, 70s, but they were willing to drive, come, fly them in, never for a fee. No fee. We never paid for anybody. But they were willing to come just to tip the hat to Jackson.
I think one of the things that I would like to do with you, and we're running into about an hour now in this, what will become a series of interviews, I guess, Greg, is to have you talk specifically about who those people were who came here, who knew Jackson on the court or at Nuremberg or in any way, and maybe name them and speak to them about them in greater detail. But I would perhaps like to close this first session of ours by going back to one other thing that you've pointed out several times during the course of this event, and that is the drive that existed in you even at that moment in 1996 when the statue was dedicated down near Love School, that you were videotaping even then. Now, where in you did that come from? I mean, you didn't wake up the day that Sandra Day O'Connor was coming and say, oh, maybe I ought to videotape this. You'd been doing it already?
Sure. It comes naturally. My mother was a 8mm film person when we were kids. The big blank or block of lights at a birthday party, filming. And so that came naturally that as we grew older, we'd all have our own cameras to preserve a family history, which then led to obviously a concept that when an event occurs, if you have a chance to film it, you should, because it'll never happen again. And so early on, capture it, not knowing what you're going to do with it. Sandra Day O'Connor, we didn't know. I don't think YouTube wasn't, if it was there, we never thought about it. To be able to preserve that, so now, frankly, 2021, to be able to go onto YouTube and to grab that which we have and to share it today on a moment's notice. Go on your iPhone, find it quickly, click it, and send it, is remarkable PR for the Jackson Center, remarkable preservation of history, and a tip of the hat, by the way, to the guy who's behind the camera here today, Ed Tomasini. And Ed has been with me from the very first time we filmed Harold Adams. I'll tell this story. February of 2001, Harold Adams' nephew had been asked by the Historical Society in Frewsburg to talk about his uncle. So
Robert Jackson.
Robert Jackson. So, great. I picked up Ed and I said, throw your camera in the car, we're going to film it because it's the first time. They asked me then to introduce him. Mm-hmm. I didn't know that. I was just filming. And so during that time in February, if somebody watches the tape closely, I tipped the hand because I had not announced the formation of the Jackson Center at that time. Kind of like coming soon, but I nevertheless leaked it. So if one were to look back and say, Greg, and Ed's got the original, he's laughing now, I'm off screen here, that I told him on the way home, I can't believe I did that. I can't believe it, because I'm under cloak of secrecy. I wasn't going to explain this. I promised Carl, Betty, everything else. So it's a good thing it wasn't covered, to television. But yeah, that in February, and subsequently we did announce it, but a lot of fanfare when we did announce it. But yeah, we've taken that and filmed everything that we could, and have subsequently used it in documentaries, have subsequently used it for history, and recycle it all the time. This is Black History Month. We have Linda Brown here. We've had James Meredith here. We've had Dorothy Cotton here. We've had John Doerr here. We've had Andrew Young here. Many people who are in the iconic civil rights movement have been here. Well, Black History Month, those people, most of them passed away by now. You just send it out. Wow, here in Jamestown. How cool.
We need to wrap this up in a moment, but I want to just sort of pull together a couple of themes that have emerged for me during the course of this hour that we've spoken, Greg. And one is how gregarious and effective you can be in terms of when people meet and you have an idea of, you didn't like the phrase selling it to them, but exposing them to it and encouraging them and being enthusiastic about it and then sort of inviting them to join in. You are a lawyer, trained lawyer, so you certainly understand the law and would have an easy grasp when you opened the biography of Robert H. Jackson of understanding why his jurisprudence was so exceptional. And there's also this theme that has been woven in here most recently of the archivist in you, in terms of wanting to make sure that everything that happens is somehow recorded just in case you might need it at some time. What those things have brought together in you and subsequently in this center, I think are a unique gift to this place, in that you had all of the characteristics in you that could lead to the building of an institution like this one.
Thank you. Yeah, it did come together. Whatever skills I had have found form here at the Jackson Center. And I have been and continue to enjoy that aspect of knowing that when we started, there was no misinformation about Jackson out there. There was just no information. So you were not dealing with negatives that you had to work against. You were just dealing with a blank board.
Tabula rasa.
Yeah, and so you were starting afresh. That which people knew in 1954, a long time had been lapsed, almost 50 years. And now we were revisiting him for the first time, and with the help of a lot of people, I mean a lot of people, we were able to create a mosaic, which we continue to create today, which is very, very exciting for the center, for I think the area. I think it's drawn attention to us. I know we're going to talk about it probably in greater detail later on, but the sum total has been a recognition of Jackson's creativity, his jurisprudence, his legacy today. His last opinion was in 1954, yet is probably quoted more today than ever. That's remarkable.
I would like to jump into that a little further, but we'll have to wait to a subsequent time. When we gather next, I would like to have you talk about the people who came here after the foundation of the Jackson Center in the early 2000s, and some noted guests and some from Jackson's past. But Greg Peterson, thank you for the opportunity to sit down for this first hour of what will be at least two, because there's certainly more to be said here, and I look forward to the next time already.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
I want to say as we conclude that I want to acknowledge Kristen McMahon, the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center, and her staff for allowing us to conduct this program here. And as mentioned before, Ed Tomasini, videographer, producer, and friend who has been a part of this from the beginning, for recording this event. For the viewer, I will say that we are speaking on February 3rd, 2021, and we have at the Jackson Center put in appropriate protocols in the Kappa Theater at this time because of the coronavirus pandemic. And we'll see you again.
Thank you, Dennis.